Hey everyone, this is Rahul with the Alternative Investors Hangout, and today we have a returning guest. He is Amar. He is my dad's second cousin. Amar, thanks for coming on again. Long time no talk.
Yeah, it's been a while. Thanks, Rahul, for having me. And it's great to be talking with all of your wonderful listeners on your podcast. So hello, everyone, again.
Alrighty, and in many of your podcasts that you've come on, you have talked about classical liberalism, and I wanted to get into the topic of what's going on in today's government. But before we get into all of that, let's go over the definition of classical liberalism, because many people still don't know what that is, and they confuse it with modern-day liberalism.
That's right. Classical liberalism can be best understood if you just look at the word liberal, okay, and think of the term liberal as being related to the term liberty. And liberty in this sense, it comes in two forms: economic liberty and civil liberty. So civil liberty would be our natural rights and our procedural rights, those being things like freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the right to vote, and so on and so forth. And then economic liberty would be what we would call capitalism. That is the private ownership and control of the means of production, which is what capital is. Capital being derived from the Latin root word caput, which means head, which originally referred to a head of cattle, meaning movable property or property that can be used for commercial purposes, for personal gain. Intellectual property is a type of capital. So classical liberalism is the idea that human beings are born to be free, and our founding fathers, the founding fathers of the United States, believed in this philosophy of classical liberalism. Now, there are different schools of classical liberalism, and our founding fathers believed in followed what could be called the natural rights school of classical liberalism, the natural rights school. That is, human beings are born with these rights that cannot be taken away legitimately, except by due process of law, when the rights of others have been violated, that is. And this was summarized very well by Alexander Hamilton, who's on our $10 bill, in a pamphlet that he wrote called The Farmer Refuted, just on the eve of the Revolutionary War in 1775. And there's one little paragraph in there that I'll read for you. And it starts like this, quote, "The sacred rights of mankind are not to be rummaged for among old parchments or musty records. They are written as with a sunbeam in the whole volume of human nature, by the hand of the divinity itself, and can never be erased or obscured by mortal power." End quote. So that's Alexander Hamilton. That was a belief system. So our founding fathers were motivated by a belief system, not merely by an ethic of wanting to be left alone, but by something that was motivating them, a kind of missionary zeal, if you will, for lack of a better term, to change the country and to change the views of mankind, to liberate human beings on this earth. They talked about the sacred rights of mankind being written as with a sunbeam in the whole volume of human nature, talking about the whole world. And Alexander Hamilton would later in the Federalist Papers, Federalist Paper number 11, which I would encourage everyone to read, that last paragraph of Federalist Paper number 11, he speaks of vindicating the honor of the human race, and he talks about Africa and Asia and the Americas in that passage. So classical liberalism is about upholding and protecting the sacred rights and liberties of every person. And I guess that's an answer to your first question about classical liberalism.
Great. And I wanted to tie in the subject of classical liberalism to look at what's going on in our government right now. And there seems to be a lot of chaos going on. And there are many individuals. You could go from Glenn Beck to any other conservatives out there. They used to laugh at them when they used to talk about this Cloward Piven strategy. But if you look on the surface, regardless of whether or not people like Beck or all these conservative guys in the media, most of them tend to be annoying, but you could put that aside. You could see that this strategy is what's going on in Obama's administration. And you could look at the leftist playbook, and this is what they use to try to implement their agenda. Wouldn't you agree with that?
What we could do is we could go through the Cloward Piven strategy and let folks decide. We could compare the Cloward Piven strategy to current policy in the Obama administration and see the similarities, convergences, and possible divergences. And I think one would find objectively many similarities between the current policies of the current administration, the Obama administration.
Yeah, so what we could do is we could look at what Cloward Piven actually is, and then we could go from the 60s onward to right now and see how it's being implemented. All right, it seems that we had some technical issues with connectivity with the internet, but anyways, Amar, what I was trying to get at, and I know you're asking how we should try to look at Cloward Piven, we could maybe look at what this strategy really is for those that are unfamiliar with it, and then you could look at from the 60s what happened to right now, if that makes sense, and if you're fine explaining that.
Yeah, that sounds like a great approach. And then we can pivot to another approach that's going on in the Republican Party that started to take hold in the Republican Party around the same time as the Cloward Piven strategy, a few years later, and that would be the trend of neoconservatism. So how does that sound overall?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay, terrific. Well, so I put this. We have this graphic here on the screen to help in understanding our terms and what we're talking about. So I believe there are three political spectrums, not just one. I think the standard model of there being simply a left and right and a continuum in between is not really useful. It's not really accurate. In the middle, and what does it mean to be in the middle, for example? It's just not defined. Well, very briefly, and there's a lot I could say about this. I look at it this way. Civilization, all human civilization, is founded upon three things, whether we're talking about ancient Egypt, medieval Europe, or modern America, or anywhere else on Earth. Three things. Number one, religion. Number two, family and marriage. And number three, private property. That's civilization. Now, the three political spectra differentiate each other based on their view of civilization, what they wish to do, how they wish to deal with humanity. There are essentially three different views of humanity, and they are three different spectra. There are different gradations of these three approaches to governing humanity. And the traditional approach, the old approach that existed for thousands of years on this earth and still exists in the Middle East, is the right-wing approach. And these terms right wing and left wing come to us from the French Revolution. The right wing approach, very briefly, is to look at those three foundational pillars of civilization and hijack them, to co-opt their religion, to coerce people into marriage and family, and to manipulate private property owners. And the left wing approach, which came about starting in the late 1700s in the French Revolution, but which was brewing over the course of 3 centuries before that, is the approach of looking at those same three pillars of civilization and destroying them, attacking, undermining, and destroying them. So, and the ultimate goal of both the right wing and the left wing is to control society. So that's why it says there, the left wing and right wing are merely two competing forms of despotism. Now, we've got the vertical axis, which is the axis of classical liberalism, which I call American conservatism. And that can be interpreted American conservatism in many ways. But I say American conservatism is classical liberalism of the natural right school. And on that axis, again, it is a spectrum. There are different gradations of classical liberalism. On that axis, we uphold and protect the sacred rights and liberties of every person. The more classically liberal one becomes no closer to the right wing or the left wing. That's why it helps to look at them as three distinct spectra. Now, the left wing and right wing have shown a tendency to borrow ideas from one another, and we'll see examples of that as we go along. So I hope this makes it clear that classical liberalism, American conservatism, is neither left nor right, left and right being European, old world concepts. Our founding fathers were neither left nor right. They were classically liberal, but they believed in classical liberty. and they're both opposed to these two forms of, control of society, despotic control of society by an elite few. Okay, so I hope that sets the stage then for the politics of the United States. Now, we've had two parties for a long time. We've had a Democrat Party and a Republican Party. Now, the Democrat Party, from the time of its inception in the 1820s up until the 1960s, was essentially a right-wing party. Okay, a right-wing party, a party that sought to create a social hierarchy with a certain order to society, where there were a lot of outcasts at the bottom, and that's typically what right-wing societies do. There's a despot at the top with a traditional religion, a traditional way of doing things. Then you've got governmental functionaries below them. Then you've got property owners. Then you've got a large labor class with very few, with very limited access to property, or very few property rights, in effect. And beneath them, you've got an underclass of people who are basically subhumans, treated as subhumans. And that was the Democrat Party. The subhumans in this case were the African Americans. At one time they were slaves, and later after slavery they were kept in an inferior position. And that was the official policy of the Democrat Party in both the South and the North. So basically the Democrat Party was a right-wing party. Now, it was not right-wing in the sense of being Nazi, although the KKK was obviously a terrorist group, and it was a Democrat terrorist group. That should be made very clear. But there are different gradations, as I've said, of right-wing and left-wing and classical liberalism. So perhaps they were not on the extreme right on average, and that being monarchy or political Islam or fascism and Nazism. And I know I'm throwing a lot of things out there that all require explanation, but which I explain in great detail in my teaching and in my writing. But the Democrat Party was somewhere on that spectrum of the right wing. Now, the Republican Party, from its founding in 1854, was more of a classical liberal party. It was the party of Abraham Lincoln, who was espousing classical liberal ideology. The idea that every human being is born with certain sacred rights, and those rights must be upheld by the government. That's the purpose of government in classical liberalism, to uphold and protect the sacred rights and liberties of every person. That's why we have a government, not to do other things, to defend the country, to protect people from the fraud and violence of one another, and to erect and maintain certain public works and public institutions which the private sector cannot erect and maintain, but which benefit society as a whole. Those three things I just listed are from Adam Smith, from The Wealth of Nations, which was published in 1776. So there we have left wing, right wing, and classical liberalism. Now, as I said, in the 1960s, the Democrat Party was taken over by the left. There's much to be said about that, but an example of that is what you mentioned, the Cloward Piven strategy. Now let's give a little introduction on the Cloward Piven strategy. Cloward Piven. So who are these individuals? Cloward and Piven. Cloward was a gentleman named Richard Cloward. He was a professor at Columbia University, and Piven was his wife, Frances Fox Piven. And they were both academics. They were leftists. They were Marxists, influenced by Saul Alinsky and influenced by the Frankfurt School Marxists, who are truly the ideological grandfathers of all leftism in the United States. They came from Frankfurt, Germany in the 1930s after World War I, and established at Columbia University institutes for the Institute for Social Research, and they were finding ways to enact Marxist policies in the United States after the abject failure of Marxism, in the sense of automatically inspiring the working class to rebel against its bourgeoisie captors and bring about a socialist and then communist revolution. So that failed, so they had to find new strategies of doing so. The Cloward Piven strategy is an example of such a strategy. So basically, this was published as a strategy in the year 1966 in the left-wing magazine known as The Nation. This was in the May 2nd, 1966 issue of The Nation. And the title of this strategy is The Weight of the Poor, A Strategy to End Poverty. And subtitled, The Theory Here to Force Change Through Chaos, as being among the most provocative of the 1960s. You can read about this. You can read the entire strategy on the website. It's a leftist website called commondreams.org, commondreams.org. It's available elsewhere as well. So basically what the Cloward Piven strategy was this. There is a welfare system. They don't like the welfare system. What they want is a guaranteed national income for every person in America. Guaranteed national income. Basically, they want communism. Right? It's communism by a different name. Now, to understand the difference between socialism and communism is very, very simple, but we have to understand it. And that is that socialism was seen as the penultimate step before communism. That was from Marxist theory. So in Marxist theory, you go from what he called primitive communism, which is a noble savage stage of mankind, primitive communism, to then next a slave society, quote unquote, next to feudalism, next to capitalism, next to socialism, and finally to communism. That was the natural progression of things, of human history in Marxist theory. So socialism, what is socialism? Socialism is a way of undermining private property rights by redistributing property and capital. So socialism is a redistribution of private property and capital. Communism is the elimination, the abolition of private property altogether, and that's how Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels defined communism in the Communist Manifesto, which was first published in 1848, which we discussed in our last podcast back in December, you'll recall. So the idea behind the Cloward Piven strategy was this: get as many people on the welfare rolls as possible to collapse the system, to cause great chaos in the United States, to collapse the welfare system altogether, to overburden the federal government and local governments which participate in that system, and to create such a chaos that somehow out of all the dust and the ashes, we will get a national guaranteed equal income for everyone. Now, what would inspire or motivate anyone to even gain an income when it's guaranteed is, of course, something that they don't address. But let's talk about some of the themes that are in this Cloward Piven strategy. Are we okay so far? Is that clear before we go into the actual details of the strategy?
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I was looking at LBJ's administration, and it seems like they slowly but steadily started to implement it during that time. If you look at, suppose, giving welfare to mothers who had their fathers or who had their baby mamas leave them, right, because they got pregnant and then the dad left and then the government came in to try to help these women out, when in fact the women could have given the kids for adoption, or they could have thought twice before they had kids out of wedlock. So do you think that started right during LBJ's administration, or it took some time? Because everyone talks about how the Vietnam era, all these individuals are crazy then, but now they're old, right, close to retirement.
Right, and some are still active even in their old age, such as Frances Fox Piven. She's in her 80s now, and still. She's
not dead.
No, she is not, and so she is still alive and teaching her views to students, young people today in America. Now, speaking of LBJ, the Cloward Piven strategy, in fact, a very important part of it, a very significant part of it, is a discussion of how the Democrat Party would be transformed as a result of this strategy. It is, in fact, a strategy for taking over the Democrat Party with leftist policies. It's very explicit in there. What do you say we go through some different points in the Cloward Piven strategy, and make clear how leftism took over the Democrat Party, and how and what its overall approach was, and how it manipulated certain concepts from the American lexicon. How does that sound?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Well, folks can read the Cloward Piven strategy. It's all available online. I'll just touch on some of the major themes in there. And just going from the top to the bottom of the document. So they talk about militant anti-poverty groups and the poor, to bring about a guaranteed annual income and thus an end to poverty. That's the big thing, ending poverty supposedly by completely collapsing the government, the welfare system. Okay, so it says here in the second paragraph of the Cloward Piven strategy, the strategy is based on the fact that a vast discrepancy exists between the benefits to which people are entitled under public welfare programs and the sums which they actually receive. So there's so many people out there who are eligible for welfare, but they're just not on the rolls. So let's get all those people on the rolls. And in so doing, we'll overwhelm the system. Okay. Now, throughout this discussion in this Cloward Piven strategy, what we see is a thing that despotic individuals and despotic outfits always do. They manipulate and redefine the concept of rights. Okay, rights, R-I-G-H-T-S. What is a right? Okay, well, in classical liberalism, a right is something, there are two kinds of rights. They're the kind that a human being is born with, and those are natural rights. Those are rights that we would have if there were no government at all, like the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion. And then there are, on the other hand, procedural rights. And those are rights that are given to us by the government, but they are rights that are to be enjoyed by everyone equally. Those are things such as the right to vote, the right to petition the government for the redress of grievances, the right to trial by jury. Those are things that the government gives to us, and the giving to us of those rights are legitimate functions of government in the classical liberal world and the natural rights school of classical liberalism. Now, what leftists will do, and what the right wing, the fascists also did, was manipulate this concept of rights. They would say that something is a right. They would declare something a right. And if something is a right, well, that means that the government must guarantee it to the people. The government must then provide it, must ensure that the people get it. And the way to do that is for the government to spend money, to spend other people's money. I mean, that's the way the government does anything, by spending tax money. So they'll declare something a right, and on that basis convince people that it is a right, and try to push for the government to provide that so-called right to people. And so that's what they do here. They talk about the rights available to them. Just scrolling down the document here, they talk about the right to income. The right to income must be guaranteed. Now, getting an income is a right. If getting an income, receiving an income is a right, well, that must mean that the government has to provide it to you. Must take action to make sure you get money, some amount of money. They also spoke of welfare rights, as in this clause, this sentence from the Cloward Piven strategy. Ignorance of welfare rights can be attacked through a massive educational campaign. Okay, so the big part of this strategy was to send out a lot of propaganda and to turn people who are poor into propagandists for the cause of getting as many people on welfare as possible. Another statement here: the fact that the campaign, this is a quote from the strategy, the fact that the campaign is intended to inform people of their legal rights under a government program, that it is a civic education drive, will lend it legitimacy. Okay, so this is what all despotic individuals do, all progressive groups, all those who wish to expand the role of the government and decrease the role of the citizen do. They redefine rights. They define something as a right, or they say that the government has a right, or that the people don't have. And in classical liberalism, governments do not have rights. Only human beings have rights. Only individuals have rights. Groups of human beings do not have rights that other groups of human beings do not have. That's classical liberalism, of our American natural rights school of thought. Okay, so let's see what else we have. Here's another quote from the strategy. Advocacy must be supplemented by organized demonstrations to create a climate of militancy. A climate of militancy. And continuing on, As the crisis develops, it will be important to use the mass media to inform the broader liberal community about the inefficiencies and injustices of welfare. And here, of course, they're using liberal in the sense of socialist. The term liberal, everyone must understand, was appropriated. It was co-opted by leftists. And that happened sometime in the late 1800s in England. And then that spread to the U.S. So originally liberal meant liberty. Now the leftists appropriated the term. They co-opted it to mean socialism, communism. Okay. They mentioned Saul Alinsky in this strategy, and so on and so forth. And they speak of creating a new democratic coalition comprised of as they say here, the national democratic leadership, however, is alert to the importance of the urban Negro vote. They would get the urban Negro vote, as they call it, by getting more African Americans on the welfare rolls to basically keep them, to maintain them in this inferior state. But again, to use them as tools for bringing about communism. Okay, so does that help? I mean, these are some of the main points of the strategy. They speak of crisis strategy as in this phrase here. These are the conditions then for an effective crisis strategy in the cities to secure an end to poverty. Of course, they have no interest in ending poverty, but in controlling society.
Right, I totally agree. I mean, if you look at how you said that they wanted to pretty much screw over African Americans, can't you say that they're trying to, I mean, some of them may not think that they're screwing over these groups, but in reality, they are trying to divide certain sectors of the population. You could go by women, Hispanics, you could go by unions, the list goes on and on. You mentioned African Americans as well. So what they want to do is they want to create division among, you could say, the typical Republican, the typical Republican in office, and point them as racist, this and that. Even though I don't like the Republicans, that's what they're trying to do. They're creating a race war, in my opinion, or they're creating a situation that these guys are just totally evil.
Yes.
And they're trying to create all of this sort of division, and you could also use the media as well, sites like the Huffington Post, creating this sort of division. Would you agree with that as well?
Yes, absolutely. You see, the right wing and the left wing both display this tendency towards what I call tribalism. Now, the right wing, the old way of controlling people, use the tribalism of the majority. We are the nation, we are the great ones, we will be victorious as a nation. So it's the tribalism of the majority. The left wing uses the tribalism of the supposedly oppressed minorities, or those who've been historically oppressed. Okay, African Americans were certainly oppressed at one time in our country, but their strategy is a strategy of control. And yes, they use tribalism to do that, to get people on board, to make very disparate groups of people think that they have a common enemy, and therefore that the leaders of the outfit that's pointing out the common enemy, that in our country being the white person, the male, the capitalist, the Christian, the Republican, and so forth, that person is a common enemy, and let's all rally together, vote for me, and I'll keep these monsters away from you. I'll keep them at bay. They're out to get you. They're out to destroy you. They're out to take away your livelihood because they hate you, because you're poor, because you're black, because you're Hispanic, because you're a member of a certain group that these evil people hate. So vote for us, and we will protect you. We will allay your fears. We will dry your tears. We will take care of you. We will keep you safe from the enemy, the evil enemy. And that's how the left works. And this is exactly what the Frankfurt School Marxists, such as Herbert Marcuse, talked about. They spoke of repressive tolerance. Repressive tolerance is intolerance of anything other than leftists. It was the idea that, I'll see if I can quote from Herbert Marcuse himself. Herbert Marcuse was one of the major Frankfurt School leftists. from Germany, and I'll just bring up his information here. Okay, so he called it repressive tolerance, and he says in his book here, in his essay Repressive Tolerance, for this struggle, I'm quoting here, quote, "For this struggle, I propose the practice of discriminating tolerance. The tolerance which is the life element, the token of a free society, can, under the prevailing conditions of tyranny by the majority, only be won in the sustained effort of radical minorities." Okay, get that, radical minorities, willing to break this tyranny and to work for the emergence of a free and sovereign majority of minorities intolerant, militantly intolerant, and disobedient to the rules of behavior which tolerate destruction and suppression. So there you have it right there. This is from 1969 again, and this is Herbert Marcuse. So he's talking about having radical minorities that are militantly intolerant of the tyranny of the majority. And so what you're seeing play out, what you just described, is this leftist strategy being played out. They've been following it to the letter, and it is just our fellow Americans who've been blindsided by this, not knowing that this is what's been going on. But they've been very upfront with their strategy from the beginning, and they're simply following it.
Yeah, they gave us their playbook, and as a result, even though the playbook is out in the open, people are still denying it or calling guys like you kooks or individuals like that.
Yeah, I've never been called a kook because I use only evidence. I don't go
exactly.
The evidence. This is what they said, and I'll let people judge for themselves.
Indeed. Okay, now I want to switch gears and go into the topic of neoconservatism. A lot of people confuse what this term actually is. They look at all these individuals in the Bush administration saying that, hey, these guys are neocons, but if you actually look at what a neoconservative is, it's a little more different than what people perceive that definition to be. Could you explain what a neoconservative is?
Yes, neoconservatism was a movement in academia that well, I guess today we more closely associate it with the Republican Party than with the Democrat Party, although not all neoconservatives were Republicans. But neoconservatism was a movement founded primarily by reformed leftists or former leftists. Among these folks were people like Norman Podhoretz, who is still alive. He has been the editor-in-chief of Commentary magazine, which has been very influential in Republican circles and Republican political circles and conservative circles today. And then there's also Irving Kristol, who passed away in 2003. He was also very influential. He's considered, quote unquote, the godfather of neoconservatism. And
he's the father of
William Kristol.
Of the, what is it called, Weekly Standard.
Right. And he is also a contributing member oftentimes on television talk shows that deal with politics. So Irving Kristol was the father of William Kristol, and Irving Kristol and his wife were former Trotskyites. Okay, so they believed in the philosophy of Leon Trotsky, the Soviet dissident who was a communist but of a different nature than the Leninists. Without going into too much detail there, he's an admitted former communist, but I don't believe when he started influencing the Republican Party that he was a communist. But these neoconservatives were generally reformed leftists. They were members of the Democrats, Socialists of America, and other groups, but they were reformed leftists, who then later turned against Soviet-style communism, pointing out the various excesses of it, the trampling upon liberty and the brutality of Soviet-style communism. So they turned away from that and took on different views. So neoconservatism actually encompasses both reformed left-wing views and former left-wing views of people who joined what I call the right wing, but not the far right wing, but the near right wing, if you will. People who are not far on the right-wing spectrum, if we're still looking at that diagram of the three political spectra, but who are close, who are not far from the center. The center being zero, by the way. The center of the three political spectra is zero. There's no government. Okay, there's no government in the middle. There's government when you go just a little bit out in any of the three directions, right, left, and upwards the direction of classical liberalism. I hope that's clear to folks. And people can ask questions in the comments section of the video, and I'll be happy to respond. So neoconservatism. I think one way in which we can approach this concept of neoconservatism is by quoting from since we chose Cloward Piven to represent how leftism took over the Democrat Party, we can use Irving Kristol as an example of views that influenced the Republican Party and which kind of moved it a little bit away from the classical liberalism of its original intent in the 1850s, that of supporting the rights of all people, to a somewhat different view. So with that, what do you say we go into some quotes from Irving Kristol?
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, Irving Kristol, in a book he wrote in 1972 called On the Democratic Idea in America, in chapter 4 of that book, here's a passage from that book. I'll just read it. Now, Irving Kristol is a very, very articulate, very well-spoken person. And in many parts of his book and his writings, he will criticize and he will speak out against elitism. And yet, in other places, it seems like he's promoting a different kind of elitism. And I'll let people judge for themselves. Here's a passage from On the Democratic Idea in America, chapter 4. Quote, "In establishing such a popular government, the founding fathers were certainly under the impression that they were expressing a faith in the common man, but they were sober and worldly men, and they were not about to hand out blank checks to anyone, even if he was common man. They thought that political institutions had something to do with the shaping of common men, and they took the question, quote, 'What kind of common man does our popular government produce?' end quote, to be as crucial a consideration as any other." Okay. Now that may sound, that's end quote right there. So that may sound like a rather benign thing to say, but let's think about that. He's saying that the founding fathers had this idea that the government will produce certain kinds of people, that the government institutions will mold the citizens into a certain kind of person, into certain kinds of citizens. He goes on and he says, "And I should guess that they would have regarded as a fair test of their labors the degree to which common men in America could rise to the prospect of choosing uncommon men, speaking for uncommon ideals, as worthy of exercising authority over them." Okay. Now, like I said, elsewhere he says that elitism is a bad thing, but here it seems like he's promoting a different kind of elitism, where people would choose men to have authority over them, uncommon men, this sort of elite group of people, when it seems to be the case, so that it seems to be what he's alluding to then in turn mold them. Okay, so interesting. Now, where that leads, I'll just let that be for now, but that is a point of view that got into the Republican Party starting in the late 60s, early 70s from the neoconservatives. I can quote from another passage in his book On the Democratic Idea in America, this from chapter 6. Okay, so another thing here. I begin here, and beginning quote, "For a system of liberal representative government to work, free elections are not enough. The results of the political process and of the exercise of individual freedom, the distribution of power, privilege, and property, must also be seen in some profound sense expressive of the values that govern the lives of individuals. An idea of self-government, if it is to be viable, must encompass both the private and the public sectors. If it does not, if the principles that organize public life seem to have little relation to those that shape private lives, you have alienation and enemy. I'm not sure what that is. An enemy and a melting away of established principles of authority." Okay, so to summarize, that's end quote right there. So to summarize what he seems to be saying here, he seems to be saying that the public sector should have some influence, some authority over the private lives of individuals. Now, one could easily miss this. Okay, but it seems very clear. One could miss it because passages like this are buried in a bunch of other things that seem to be supporting liberty and the general concept of the primacy of the individual. But when we read things like this, it seems like he still has a lot of that big government progressivism in his purview and in his vision for America. And it's views like this that were influencing the Republican Party. Now, I'm talking about neoconservative right now, neoconservatism on the domestic front, not in the foreign policy front. That's a whole different ballgame altogether, foreign policy. I'm strictly focusing on domestic policy when I talk about neoconservatism at this time. So foreign policy, that would be perhaps another discussion for another time.
Right.
So I have a third passage. So both of those passages were from 1972 from his book On the Democratic Idea in America. Now, I have a third passage from 2003, the year that Mr. Irving Kristol passed away. So this may have been one of his last articles, and this is published, in fact, in the Weekly Standard. So it becomes clear then, what from this passage that I'm about to read it, their view of big government and the welfare state becomes much more clear. Okay, and I begin. This is from 2003, again from Irving Kristol. Beginning quote. This leads to the issue of the role of the state. Neocons do not like the concentration of services in the welfare state and are happy to study alternative ways of delivering those services. But they are impatient with the Hayekian notion that we are on, quote, the road to serfdom, end quote. Neocons do not feel that kind of alarm or anxiety about the growth of the state in the past century, seeing it as a natural, indeed inevitable, natural and indeed inevitable. Because they tend to be more interested in history than economics or sociology. They know that the 19th century idea, so neatly propounded by Herbert Spencer, and so on and so forth, I'll just move forward here, people have always preferred strong government to weak government, although they certainly have no liking for anything that smacks of overly intrusive government. Neocons feel at home in today's America to a degree that more traditional conservatives do not. Okay, so again, it's strange to see this seeming doublespeak from Irving Kristol, where on the one hand he'll say that government should not be overly intrusive, but a welfare state is perfectly natural and normal. So he would criticize and condemn the things that the welfare state has produced, such as illegitimacy in the family, the loss of work ethic, the loss of the feeling of value and the feeling of purpose in American males of low income backgrounds in the family, and they're leaving the family altogether and living lives of hopelessness and crime. He would criticize those aspects of the modern welfare state. Yet he seems to be comfortable with big government, but a different kind of welfare state, different kind of big government, a different kind of progressivism. And I can segue from that to something that has come out just in the last few days. But before we do that, did you have any comments on these passages that I read from Irving Kristol and neoconservatism?
So if you look at the neoconservatism today, I know you said that you're going to delve into it maybe in another topic, but people who call neoconservatives today are more in line with the foreign policy but not in line with the big government. Is that how it is? Because I think there is a shift in that regard, because I know we had this conversation off air before, but you told me that majority of these neoconservatives from the 1960s who were once liberals, like progressive liberals, and not talking about the classical liberals,
right.
tended to
leftist liberals, left,
right.
Basically. Yes. Continue.
Yeah, I'm not stereotyping here, but they tended to be Jewish. But then now, if you look at the neoconservatives today, they still may be Jewish, but it's more on the foreign policy end. Do you see that?
Well,
in that regard, because it seems like they want limited government, but at the same time, the individuals or the Republicans in office, they act like big government liberals.
Well, they act like neoconservatives. in that, we saw in this passage from Irving Kristol some degree of doublespeak, in my opinion, where he says that, we don't want intrusive government, but we still want a government that delivers welfare services in different ways than they are currently being delivered. So he wants non-obtrusive government, but he wants a welfare state, and you just can't have it both ways. And the Republican Party, I believe, having been influenced by these neoconservatives, they have been influenced also by their rhetoric, their way of thinking. They will speak of liberty. They will speak of limited government. They will speak of freedom and fiscal responsibility. But when it comes time to deliver those things, they make excuses for why they can't do it, or why it's just not feasible, or why the other party isn't letting them. They come up with excuses. And then when people who actually believe in fiscal responsibility and believe in individual liberty, such as perhaps the Tea Party, whatever one believes, whatever one's opinion is of the Tea Party, however skillful or inept they may have been, whatever the case may be, they are actually serious about limited government, serious about restoring individual liberty. But when they're faced with the Republican establishment, which I believe is influenced by neoconservatism and has been for decades, they run up against a brick wall. The Republican leadership simply says, okay, you people, yeah, you're talking about liberty and fiscal responsibility, reducing spending. That's nice. Just go over there and sit in the corner and be quiet. We'll call on you when we need you to vote the way we want you to vote. Okay, and so there's that conflict going on in the Republican Party right now between those who actually believe in classical liberalism, believe in the limitations on government, though they don't realize that that's classical liberalism, because the term liberal has been so misused by both people on the Republican side and the Democrat side that they don't understand what that term means. But essentially, they are representing the classical liberal point of view. The Tea Party, whether it realizes it or not, is representing classical liberal views, and it should embrace that fact and study classical liberalism of the natural rights school and start propounding those in powerful ways. So we're seeing that conflict in our society, and we're seeing that this civil war in the Republican Party right now. Now, with regard to the point that has been floated oftentimes about the neoconservatives being Jewish, okay. Well,
I'm not trying to attack Jewish
correct,
people.
and I know neither of us are, and I know, and that you're pointing that out.
You have to be really careful about it, because people, whenever you start bashing on neocons, the anti-Semite card may show up at times.
That's right. That's right, and I certainly, don't subscribe to that point of view, for many reasons, and simple evidence, bears it out. Many non-Jews, have this point of view. Of a large government, people on the Republican side, people who vote Republican, who are, diehard Republicans, and I differentiate between Republicans and American conservatives who are classical liberal, and that's how I define American conservatism. American conservatism is classical liberalism. That's how I define it. European conservatism is right-wing. Okay, it's right-wing conservatism. That's not American conservatism. And I explain all this, and I know this will bring up lots of questions and perhaps some criticism, but I believe this is all very sound. I can explain it in detail, and I do so in my teaching. So yes, with regard to that, many non-Jews are influenced by that. Speaker Boehner, I believe is advocating neoconservative positions. He is not a Jewish individual. It's true. Yeah, many of the neoconservatives, Irving Kristol, Norman Podhoretz, were of Jewish background, Jewish descent. How that plays into their political views, I'm not going to get into that. But they did leave leftism, early in their lives. But they embraced a different form of big government. They moved away from left-wing progressivism to right-wing progressivism. But they embraced some aspects of classical liberalism as well. So the Republican Party today talks like they're classical liberals. When they go out campaigning, they use classical liberal terminology: liberty, freedom, individual rights, restoring our Constitution, the 10th Amendment, fiscal responsibility, limited government. That's the one they love to say, limited government. They'll use the language of classical liberalism. but they'll enact the policies of neoconservatism, which is a amalgam of some classical liberalism and some right-wing ideology, some right-wing approach to the control of society. And these are natural approaches that that human beings have gravitated towards, without people being conscious of the fact that these are time-tested ways of controlling society. This is just what humanity. These three spectra, these three approaches, are what humanity has gravitated towards. Now, right-wing was the traditional way of controlling a society since time immemorial, until these two other things came along, those being classical liberalism and leftism, in mainly the 1700s, we can say. So I hope that's all clear. This is a lot that we've gone through, but these three political spectra, if you look at things this way, it will clarify everything that you're seeing. They are spectra. So if we look at classical liberalism, there will be, say, libertarians on the further end, the more in the vertical direction on that spectrum, who will say that, hey, prostitution and recreational drugs should be legalized. That's liberty because they don't affect other people. Okay, so they're on a certain point on that vertical axis. Now, other more mainstream conservatives, American conservatives, that is, would say, hey, no, we believe in liberty for the individual, but we don't go that far. We don't want to give the liberty of prostitution and the liberty of recreational drug use for anyone. We don't believe that liberty goes that far. So you see, it is a spectrum, and that's how people who believe in liberty have to understand one another. They're just at different points along this spectrum, different points along this continuum. And yes, people on different points along the spectrum will argue with one another. We'll see differences between one another, but they have to understand that they're on that spectrum and not on these other two spectra.
Totally, that makes sense. And before we wrap this up, do you have any other points that you want to make, pressing points?
I just believe that we need to revive the revolutionary spirit. We need to get back to what our founding fathers believed in. And I started out with that quote from Alexander Hamilton, where he speaks of the sacred rights of mankind as being written as with a sunbeam on the whole of human nature, by the hand of the divinity itself, and can never be erased or obscured by mortal power. That is how we have to view our fellow American, our fellow human being. Okay, we have to look at someone of a different race, okay, of a different religious background, and think, hey, that person, rather than being, oh, that person's different, that person votes differently than I do. I wonder if that person, is a fan of Obama or a fan of this other politician. I wonder if they're on my side or not on my side. Our country, our republic, was founded upon a belief system. Our founding fathers fought, they risked their lives, they pledged to one another their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor, as written in the Declaration of Independence, because of a belief, okay, a belief in the sacred rights of mankind, a belief that the rights of mankind don't come from old parchments or musty records, as Alexander Hamilton said, but they are written as with the sunbeam in the whole volume of human nature. Every human being is entitled to these, it has these rights naturally. We believe in natural rights. Now, we have to be evangelists, if you will, okay? We have to spread the gospel, if you will, the gospel of Americanism, the gospel of classical liberalism and republicanism with a lowercase r, that is. We're not talking about the Republican Party. Republicanism, the idea of a republic, where every human being has rights, and the government exists to protect our rights, to protect us from outside harm, and to do only those minimal things which the private sector cannot do competently, but which can benefit everyone, and to protect everyone from the fraud and violence of one another. We have to have that attitude about every human being. That's what our founding fathers' attitude was, and they put us on a path towards ending slavery. They respected the American Indians, and were trying to protect their land rights. Things changed in the 1820s, though, and that's a whole different discussion altogether. But you can take it to the bank. All the evidence shows our founding fathers were moving us in the direction of protecting the sacred rights of mankind, including African Americans, including the American Indians, who were citizens, by the way. Free blacks were citizens of this country at the founding of this republic in at least 5 states. And those were New Hampshire, New York, New Jersey, and Massachusetts, and North Carolina, believe it or not. and other states as well, but definitely those. And you can read about those, by the way, in the dissenting opinion of the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court decision, Dred Scott decision of 1857, that being the Dred Scott case. So that, of course, brings up all these other ideas, all these other things that we can talk about. But that's what I want to leave people with. We need to believe in the sacred rights of mankind. Yes, even the sacred rights of those people that you look sideways at. When you wonder, I wonder does that person really believe in freedom? Is that person going to vote the way I want to vote? I want them to vote. Well, let's fight for everyone's liberty, and let's have that attitude. And if we have that attitude, we can reach out to people that we otherwise would not be able to reach out to, and persuade and affect with our beliefs. We have to believe in something. We can't just believe in anti-leftism. We can't just believe in not having a leftist president, or not having a right-wing president, or not having neoconservatism, or not having this, or not having that. We have to believe in something positively. What do we want for our country? What do we want for our fellow citizens? So let's think along those lines.
Great, Amar. And before I let you go, how can people follow your work again, or just learn a little bit about yourself if you're willing to give some information?
Yeah, sure. Folks can email me at asalgia@yahoo.com. That's A, S as in Sam, ALGIA @yahoo.com.
Awesome, Amar. We should have you back in a few months.
Terrific. I'd look forward to that. Thanks very much, Rahul, for taking all the time, and thank you all for all of you who got to the end here. Thank you all for listening.
Indeed. Thanks, guys. Bye.